So I wanted to take just a couple of minutes and explain how the Gospels came to be. Look, the earliest Gospel that we have is actually the Gospel of Mark, even though it comes second, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Mark was written about 40 years after Jesus' crucifixion. We know that because there's a line in there that indicates that it couldn't have happened before the destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era. Matthew and Luke were written about 15 years later, sometime in the mid-80s of the Common Era. What they did was they took the Gospel of Mark and they copied it. That's why if you put the Gospels right next to each other, you can see verbatim passages. Doesn't mean that it was word for word inspired. It means that Matthew and Luke copied from Mark. They also used a saying source, a collection of sayings called Q. And that's why some of the sayings are word for word the same in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Then Matthew and Luke both had their own sources. So these three Gospels are called the Synoptic Gospels because if you read them together, that's what synoptic means, then you can see the similarities. Now the Gospel of John is different. It was written in the 90s of the Common Era, and the followers of Jesus were going through a very transitional time. The people in the community to whom the gospel was written were leaving the synagogue because they had differentiated themselves so much from the people who continued to worship there. So we find that reflected in the Gospel of John. We also find Jesus speaking in long, eloquent speeches. He no longer teaches in parables like he does in the Synoptic Gospels. He gives these long, profound theological statements. So I want you to think about this for just a second. If this gospel was written, say, 60 years after Jesus' crucifixion, how likely do you think it is that those words actually originated with Jesus? Look, historical Jesus scholars have said that probably none of the teachings in the Gospel of John actually originated with Jesus. So think about the dangers of coming up with your primary theology based on the Gospel of John, which so many Christians do. It's much better to look at teachings that we can historically know originated with Jesus. And you know that because they come from different sources. Mark, maybe the Gospel of Thomas, maybe Q, sources that didn't depend on each other. It's best to develop our theology in that way.